Hi there, Steve Kaufman here. Today I want to combine sort of two issues. One is that words, especially verbs and nouns and adjectives, but all verbs can have different forms. And there's always an issue, especially when we talk about word count at length, where we count the number of words you know. Should we be talking about individual words, like each form of the word, or should we be talking about word families in some way? So that's one issue. And the other issue is the use of Anki or SRS systems versus more emphasis on exposure, reading, listening, and so forth. And the reason I'm talking about that is because we received a letter at Link. Actually, it was addressed to my son Mark. And this person was saying that they'd been a heavy user of Anki, but then they discovered they were spending 10 times as much time on Anki review as they were spending reading and listening to the language. So they, with Link, moved into more of a listening reading mode, but they still kept Anki because, if they came across a word, for example, in Russian, the verb iskать is to look for, but I look is ищу. So he said often he couldn't tell whether this was in fact a word that he already knew. So this person would then create some kind of a drill in Anki to go through all the different forms of iskать, including ищу. But that still left him with a lot of time spent with Anki, which took away from the time that he could spend reading and listening. So, I thought about this. So then I say, okay, first of all, everyone has their own way of studying. Anki has its enthusiastic followers, and that's fine. So I'm only going to talk about what I do and how I perceive the role of Anki versus exposure, reading and listening, and this issue of different forms of words. So, first of all, with regard to forms of words, nowadays the dictionaries that we can access online are so good that if you see the word issue, you will see, for example, if you use context reversal, which is an excellent dictionary, you can see the definition of issue, you can see examples of issue in use, and you can see a full conjugation table of that verb with the one that you've saved here highlighted, so that you can immediately deal with where that form of the word fits in. It's impossible to absorb that whole table. But if you keep on going back to it as you come across different forms of the verb and save different forms of the verb as separate, terms that you save at Link, and on each occasion you can look at the table, slowly that is helping you start to recognize the different forms and the fact that they all come together. So I think even if you don't use an Anki deck, just focusing on listening and reading, and then referring to the dictionary, and then referring to these tables, every time you come across a different form of a word, a verb, or a noun, I think that can be quite effective. So I think there are ways that you can deal with this issue. The second question that comes up is often a link. Why do we count them as separate words when they're part of the same, essentially the same word? I mean, the extreme example is car and cars, or in the case of Arabic, where a plural always has a wa in front of it. So you're getting a 2 for 1 because you see it as a noun the initial time, then you see a wa plus the noun, and you get credit for that as a known word. My view on that is it doesn't really matter. The known word total is simply a milestone indicating that you are progressing in the language. It's a little bit motivating. I have often sort of referred to it as the mechanical rabbit that the dogs in the dog races chase. So every time I get on Link, I see where I am in my profile, how many words I know, and I'm motivated to increase that. So even if the numbers are a little inflated, if my desire to chase that known words total is getting me to read more and more and listen more and more, then that's a good thing. So that the main role of this known word total is not so that you can brag to people, but that this hopefully motivates you to consume more material, to spend more time listening and reading. Because I think that you shouldn't be spending 10 times as much time reviewing words as you are exposing yourself to new material where you will find new words and at the same time encounter some of the words that you have previously saved and which are now highlighted in yellow at link. And also there's a practical problem too in that, you know, again, I only have so much time to spend on language learning. The biggest sort of type of activity, the most important activity is listening, because I can do it. Yesterday, you know, we had my son Mark was visiting with his wife here in Palm Springs. I took him to the airport. So on my way back, that's 35 minutes, I'm listening to Arabic. So it's so easy to organize the listening part. But of course, if you listen, you have to understand what you're listening to. And therefore that gets you to read it. So now you have to read it. And when you read it, there are words you don't know. So you look them up and save them, and then they're highlighted in yellow. So that this is spurring you to more exposure. I do occasionally review the sort of flashcard activities after each lesson, but if I were to spend a lot of time reviewing these in an Anki type situation, I wouldn't have much time left for listening and reading. So if I look at my statistics, for example, in Arabic at this point, I have created 4,700 links. That means that I have saved 4,700 terms that I have encountered in my listening and reading. I have 2,000 known words, whatever that means. And I'm encouraged, motivated to get it up to 3,000, because I've announced that when I get to 3,000 known words, I'm going to start trying to speak to people. I have read 20,000 words, and that's only the first time I read them, because I have reread many of these stories. So actually I've read much more than that. So that's a lot of time. And my listening, and this is quite accurate now because I do my listening either, listening to the lesson as I study the lesson, or on a playlist while I'm, driving my car, as I said. So I have listened 90 hours. That's an awful lot of time. So I don't know that I'd have a lot of time left over to spend on Anki. Just out of curiosity, I went back to my Greek learning, and I spent, more than 6 months on Greek. And there I read 200,000 words, at least to the extent that they're tracked at link. And there I had created 27,000 links that I had saved 27,000 words and phrases. Would I have had time to review them in Anki? I doubt it. And I'd be interested to hear from people how they managed to juggle Anki review with lots of listening and reading. Of the 27,000 links that I created, I ended up learning 6,000. That means that 6,000 of those 20,000 were converted to known. But I didn't do a lot of flashcard review. But when I see these in my reading, then I have a chance to move the status eventually to known. So that those 6,000 words I would have seen again and again, and then move them to known at some point. But my total known word number was 9,000. So presumably there were a lot of forms of words that I felt I didn't need to save now, because I knew what they meant based on having been exposed to other words that were similar to them, maybe other forms of the verb or whatever it might be in Greek. So again, would I have been further ahead with an Anki deck? Would I have more than 9,000 known words? Would I have exposed myself to 200,000 words of reading? Would I have, I don't know, I don't have my listening stats here, but it's going to be more than the 90 hours, because 90 hours of Arabic is after 3 months. So I can assume that it's well over, it might be 200 hours of listening in Greek. Would I have done that if I had been spending that much time on Anki? I don't know. So obviously the SRS algorithms are helpful, but it is only a form of exposure. And I have had the experience that sometimes the things that I learned through deliberate learning using flashcards or whatever method, where now I think I know it, somehow later on I don't know it again. And to some extent, I guess the SRS algorithm is supposed to bring it back to you at a point in time where theoretically you haven't yet forgotten it, but that doesn't guarantee that you won't forget it again. And I would rather be motivated to continue to meet these words in context, and along the way expose myself to all these other words that I've been learning in a natural living context, whether I'm listening or reading. Because ultimately it's my view that the learning of the language, not just the words, but even the pronunciation and that sense of the language, and above all, listening comprehension, which is such an important skill, all of that comes from natural exposure to meaningful context, listening and reading. So whatever you do in sort of deliberate learning, deliberate reading of grammar books, deliberate study of flashcards, it does help, but it is not as effective if you have limited time as exposing yourself to the language. So I guess to some extent the strategy that one adopts, aside from personal preferences, will depend on how much time you have to spend. And in my case, if I can get in a half hour to an hour of listening every day and add a little bit of reading and maybe 5-10 minutes of flashcard review, that seems to optimize my time. But I accept that different people have different circumstances, different things they like to do. So I'm sure I'll get some pushback from staunch, and it's not to challenge the Anki users, but it's merely to indicate that this is how I learn. So I hope that was interesting and useful. Bye for now.